our three TAs have worked hard and long correcting these many exams, about 100. And I've gone over selection of them at every score. And I think we will say, I'll say it in different ways, but I think the main thing is applause that you're doing a terrific job. Many of you are not dialed in and present right now online, but you're doing the readings, you're reflecting, you write about this stuff thoughtfully, and it's wonderful to see. Folks are welcome to participate in any way that you see fit. And but a key bottom line is what a takeaway is in your head. And you've shown us that you've got big things, main points, key readings, main authors, big concepts are there. So let me call on Luke, Michael, and Wen Mio for elaboration on any of that.
Yeah, like Professor Clark said, the class did very, very, very well on the whole. The average grade is an A. Yeah, we were just we were very impressed all around. And if anyone is unsatisfied with their grade for whatever reason, there wasn't any particularly bad grades, but even still, if anyone's unsatisfied with their grade, they're welcome to write a memo about answering one of the essay prompts from the exam that they did not select. And if you send that to us within a week, so by next Monday, you'll be able to recoup some points on your exam. So we'll post an announcement on Canvas about that, and the grades will go live. Now that we've gotten approval, the grades will go live right after class today. So anyone have any questions or anything, or no? Michael, Wen Miao, do you have anything else you'd like to add? Okay. So yeah, and yeah, like on Canvas, we posted the exam date. It's on the new version of the syllabus as well. But March 19th, Friday, from 6:30 to 8:30 p.m. So, yep, and we'll get more info about the final exam to you shortly.
Any questions anyone wants to raise? Or any further comments from Michael or Wen Mio? Okay. I was confused about the syllabus and timing because we basically have a 9-week quarter this quarter instead of 10 weeks. And the syllabus was set up with 10 weeks initially. And I realized this as we got closer to the end, but we have readings from which are labeled, well, I'm not sure which, I've now got multiple versions of syllabus, but basically it's a section is labeled ethnicity and race. On the other hand, we've got sections on these topics which go back through many of the earlier sections. So I've got a number of lectures and sets of lecture points that I want to make and can bring them in different ways. But these are also new and controversial enough right now with all the discussion about diversity that we want to welcome probably a little more discussion than usual. Nevertheless, trying to be self-conscious to ourselves as to what is a sort of a personal instinct, if you will, a sort of a quick reaction versus a more thoughtful articulation, which may be either what's happening, why, sort of a social science analytical question, or it may be a more normative question of what should be this way or that way, and what might be done to make things different or better in some way. And all of this is going on in the media, in the lawsuits, in the attacks on our political leaders in Chicago, in Washington, in the Philippines, in Brazil, in Eastern Europe, in Russia, in China. And we all live in glass houses. Nobody's completely right or wrong for sure. And so how to get a handle on this is one big question. That is, I would say, our main focus in the course is not to deny the importance of your or my personal background or interest or ideology, if it's articulated that way, such as a party program or whatever else, but to try to use the social science that we've got to try to look at what we have in the way of more coherent statements. And the background illustration of this are the three readings on the reading list. And these well, I'll come back and maybe do a little bit more on the context. I mean, we'll go back and forth on the context, but most of the discussion of, and I'm talking now, I'm framing all three readings really, because they all deal with changes and dramatic ways of reinterpreting what's happening. And these are all pretty darn good statements. Dahl's book is the classic. I mean, it's considered one of the paramount classics in political science. Dahl was probably the leading political scientist in the world for a couple of decades in the 60s. And this is his major book. Mark Hansen, the political science head of the MAPS program now, but he was former dean of the division, was a student at Yale where Dahl was. And he would say he would reread Who Governs every year. I had a sabbatical. I went to Yale, and I was a visiting professor at Yale in political science and sociology because I wanted to be able to talk to Dahl at lunch and to talk with him about all this stuff. And he was one of the fellows in one of the what they call colleges at like the houses at Chicago. And so we had lunch. I've forgotten what it was, maybe 2 or 3 times a month. It was terrific. Okay, so, and I'm saying that because we haven't talked much about Who Governs except in this section. And I would nevertheless add that this is probably the weakest section of the book. So I'm going to take the occasion to say a few things about the book more generally as a classic in political science. Yeah, I'll go ahead and do that now. I'll talk about Dahl first, and then Joseph He, because Dahl was 1961. Joseph He's, I don't have a date here, but it was 10 years or so ago. He did several things to generate the material that he used in the book. Well, he lived in New Haven for most of his career. He was almost always at Yale, and Yale was the #1 political science department. With him, with Harold Lasswell, left Chicago and went there. Gabriel Allman was there, and then at Princeton. Carl Deutsch was at Harvard and back and forth. I mean, these were all stars who were together for a good chunk of the time there, more than anywhere else. So part of it is he knew the town well. His wife was very active in state politics, and he knew the folks. There were many Yale students who were around in civic things. My own sister got a master's degree at Yale and worked directed a health clinic for most of her adult life there. So I heard more from that as well. So point one is sort of personal engagement, continual ethnographic participation, knowing the folks, going to meetings, etc. Point two, he had some of the top political scientists. I say political scientists in any field. They were not urbanists. They were not local folks. They were not ethnic specialists at all. Aaron Wildavsky, number one, Nelson Polsby, number two, Raymond Wolfinger, number three. And they all worked with him variously on this book. Wildavsky, the most distantly, he actually published another book on Oberlin. He taught at Oberlin a year or two before he went to Berkeley for most of his career. But the Oberlin study was a parallel, simpler version of Who Governs, and it followed some similar patterns. But the Nelson Polsby did a PhD that was a review of the literature. He was at Chicago in sociology, did a book on Hyde Park and the racial ethnic conflicts in Hyde Park with Peter Rossi and Robert Dentler, called The Politics of Urban Renewal. But Polsby was there looking at all kinds of issues of race, conflict, group politics, etc. At the same time that he was writing his PhD, and it's published as all these are out as books, which was I would say, it looked like a coherent analytical review of the literature on how does politics get made and how does this happen locally. But in fact, it was quite biased. And as I was reading this stuff increasingly myself, as I read more and more, I realized this was really not such a good statement. So I had a little exchange with him. But what's the bigger point of this? The interpenetration of ideology, discipline, method, and findings. The ideology, I would say the ideology was a little, well, in the case of some like Floyd Hunter, continuing with Domhoff, continuing with Black Lives Matter today, you get aspects of sort of challenging the capitalist establishment. And Dahl, I would say, was not, Dahl basically, he and his wife were moderate leftist, New Deal Democrats in terms of commitment, and as were probably the majority of political scientists, sociologists at the time. Ideology, method, a big issue was the method that Floyd Hunter had used, a method of interviewing elites and asking them, using a so-called snowball sampling technique, asking each person, who are the most important people in Atlanta, and what are their names, and how would you rank them if you're 20 of them, so forth, and then keep adding names to that, and then ranking them. And then at the end, when you pretty much got a relatively complete set of information, you'd say this is Floyd Hunter gave his name to this whole field called community power structure. This is the community power structure. And it was a network, a set of connections among people and their ranking of who was at the top. The foundation was the simple question I mentioned: who's most important person or most important in Atlanta? That was the whole foundation of who governs. This was a fallacious question. The methodology was flawed, not because of simple statistics or something like that, but because of the conceptualization. So Dahl really had worked on this, thinking about writing about power and influence, and he'd done a book with Harold Lasswell on power. So I'm going to introduce 4 or 5 of the big concepts, which you should all know as part of your general education in the social sciences, even if you don't. Then this is, I mean, if you got Robert Dahl on your reading list, you ought to know about these concepts, even if they're not central just to ethnicity, but we need them to understand ethnicity in these debates. Okay, first big concept, issue area. Instead of asking who's the most important person, you've got to tell or ask an informant concerning what, important for what, and what Dahl then chose were what he called issue areas. And the 3 he used were mayoral elections, school board decisions, and urban development, such as housing, growth, loans from banks to build new factories or whatever, measured by land value, by the growth of development activities. And this is much discussed, for instance, by Logan and Molich in their book. But the point is, in the urban development area, business leaders were more important, which was the main. I'm getting now the third point. So ideology, method, concepts, and findings. So the concept of issue area leads you then to the finding that if you study these 3 issue areas and you ask who are the important people in this issue area, and then in that issue area, mayoral election, school board, development, you find 3 almost totally different sets of persons. That completely contradicts the image you get from reading Floyd Hunter or many others, the Italian elitist theorists, Pareto and Mosca, the leaders of them, Roberto Michels III, who basically had the sense that power was a pyramid, and there were people right at the top, and they made the big decisions, and others just sort of followed along. And they were rather explicit about this. So Dahl basically said, showed in New Haven, you really had 3 quite different sets of people. I'll flash forward and say that as later work went on, I and others were involved. We did the first comparative studies of these issues. These were not always the case. There are and were towns which were more close to a pyramid and which did have business leaders at the top. Some of the southern, especially Texas cities, Waco, Dallas, Fort Worth, Houston, to some degree, in some time periods, were more this way. Very openly, you had the business organizations would say, we support the following 7 candidates for the city council. We're giving them money, and we are opposed to these other people, and here's why we oppose them. So it wasn't if this was a hidden corporate capitalist elite. These people were out fighting for their business self-interest, labeled in those terms. On the other hand, they would talk in terms of what's good for us is good for the whole city. And you had to look more closely one issue area at a time, to see where and how there were differences. And they differed by city and over time, as I'm mentioning. But there's several books on these Texas cities because of exactly these kinds of debates. And these were ripe extreme outliers of business leadership. Atlanta was the other studied and restudied case, again, of course, in the South. And business was the answer for both Hunter and then later on Clarence Stone. So once you have the idea of differences by issue area, his Dahl's label for this was pluralism, that you don't have a single elite everywhere. You have different kinds. And if you begin to see this in these two, if you go to sub-issues or you'd go to different stages and you ask questions as we did later on when we were doing this comparatively and nationally, who initiated, who supported, who mediated, who opposed, and who prevailed in an issue area, you can often get 5 different sets of leaders at different stages. So we collected data like this in the first big comparative study in the country of 51 cities. And in some cities, for sure, we have lots of pluralism in that way. But in other cities, we had the opposite. Things were closer to the closed Hunter Pareto type elite. Third big concept, why might we find these differences? Here, a critical concept was that Dahl used was resources. If you even bring that idea in and say resources are what people have, and he made a list of things like money, votes, control of the media, organizational backing like unions or political parties or civic groups. The corollary of that idea is that resources are not always spent or used. And if you start to think about that, and then there's been a lot of more active work since, what proportion of you folks in this class, your time and your money, or your parents' friends, your parents or your friends' time and money devoted to political leadership, politics, nationally, local, or whatever else, and is for how many, there are a few people in the world, maybe people like Lenin and Mao, for whom it may be 95%. But for most people, it's a heck of a lot lower, even those political activists who some of you will be in this course. I mean, we often have, and I know some of you are, Mylan Patton is a high level activist in the Harris School, et cetera. So the resource idea then says which resources are actually used, and the way at least Dahl proposed answering that was to ask the kinds of questions I just spelled out. He didn't do it with a survey question. He did it with longer, deeper, multi-year case studies of these 3 issues: mayoral elections, school board decisions, and urban development, and has discussions of these in the chapters of Who Governs. I won't go over those, except to point out that some later critics like Domhoff and others have said he didn't really talk about the African Americans. He did, but not in detail, and that has led to some later criticism. Did he ignore the interests and concerns of African Americans, and how much were they distinctive enough that they might transform the generalized findings which he offered from the book? Okay, I'll leave that as an open question for us now, but try to rather than trying to say how does it work for one ethnic group, I'd say the takeaway for you and for me is, what are the concepts that Dahl created and brought into social science that we ought to know about and potentially consider along with other options today? The idea is, if you have resources and then you have use of them, you can he called that influence. So power and influence, or power or resources can be money and knowledge and votes. Power can be in between, and that can be the method, the result of the method used by Hunter. So Dahl tended to stay away from that. And then he talked about influence, which would be measured through what he called the decisional method, in contrast to what he and then others started to call Hunter's approach the reputational method, because it only got the reputation. If you ask who's the most important person in Atlanta, people give you an answer, but one person may have in mind who can give you the biggest loan because they're president of a bank, who can give you the best press coverage because he owns the newspaper, who can give you the best heart transplant because he's a doctor. Heart transplant? Well, okay. If for different, so the point of the story is issue areas differ, and the attention to this then leads to multiple related concepts. One is the idea of pyramiding, that if you have, say, one person has money, another person has owns a newspaper, and a third person is the head of the Democratic Party, they may either work together and have a coalition and build a pyramid together, or they may fight and be in separate opposed camps in that sense, and then try to build little coalitions depending on the issue. Or to add complexity, whether these three build a pyramid together or not can be very different from one year to the next and from one issue area to the next. That's the idea of potential pluralism, that you don't tend to have fixed positions and types of participants. So he had a couple of years of study of contemporary, ethnographic-like participation that you have in lots of case studies. There were roughly 166 of these in the 20-30 years when this was probably the hottest issue in the social sciences in those years. Everybody took a position on these kinds of issues. Pyramiding, resources, mobilization. How do you mobilize through such things as pyramiding? But another big one was slack. Slack is sort of the converse of what proportion of your resources are you using? And if you're using lots of your resources, you may be an exception, but for most people in most political systems, especially American cities, there's lots of slack. Slack is unused resources, which have potential for influencing decisions. What proportion of Bill Gates's money is spent in his local town? Tiny proportion. So even though he may be a very affluent guy, if he's not interested in the local politics, Bill Gates may have zero impact. I don't know. I know very little about the immediate area where he lives or whatever. But the point is, there are lots of people that way that they don't tell, they don't show, they don't spend their money on local issues. People like, so I won't try to overstate, but there's some people the opposite who try to show very flamboyantly what funds they have. But the point is, there is a lot of slack in most political systems almost all the time. And so that means something like the idea of voter turnout or participation more generally, whether you join a party, whether you go out and demonstrate or not, whether you lobby, whether you talk to your friends about voting or help them or not, these vary a lot. And if you get, and as happened in this most recent presidential election with Trump and Biden, there was much more mobilization and much overcoming of the slack, or much reduction of the slack, than has been true. I think some have said then in terms of absolute numbers, than by some measures all the presidential elections held to date. Nevertheless, what proportion of the people voted? Not that many. That is, compared to countries like, well, let's say Australia, where they have officially required voting, or in Italy they used to require you to vote. On the other hand, so I don't want to divert too much. But I'm just introducing briefly these big concepts: pyramiding, resources, slack, issue specificity, issue areas, and that these in turn vary by ethnic group. The most visible, so he goes through in the history, this is another section of the book, which is the main one for this part of the course. I briefly mentioned African Americans, but the main history in New Haven, to simplify, as he does in the first chapters, was the old white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, who were 90% of the population in the early 19th century, were gradually, and they were naturally the mayor and the city council members. By the middle to end of the 19th century, like most New England towns, these groups were voted out of office. And following Tocqueville and others, Dahl shows that they generally simply withdrew. They moved to the suburbs, or they didn't stay involved. They were graciously silent, in contrast to what Tocqueville would discuss, say, as the French aristocracy, where you had revolutions and people fighting each other through the whole 19th century, a little bit like Donald Trump. So in that respect, the sense of the rules of the game and who and how they would be followed were an important part of the whole story when you get to specific decisions, not just resources. So point one, the white Anglo-Saxons were dominant and then gradually superseded. The first group he called the ex-plebes, and these were basic, that was the ex-plebeians, a rather abstract name, but these were mainly Irish Catholics, like the ones you've heard us talk about, and some of you have learned more on your own about this great city of Chicago and its Irish Catholic tradition. You had strong Irish Catholic leadership in Boston, New Haven, Providence, parts of New York as well. Not as much as Chicago, but nevertheless important. And Dahl does not, the point I'm making here is Dahl does not elaborate Irishness. He doesn't try to say what was specifically different about the Irish compared to the others. He does go into a little bit in their competition with the other major group in these same northeastern cities, the Italians. So the Italians and the Irish tended to fight each other. And that's been true up to the present in New Haven today, basically. The point is, Dahl does not pay attention to ethnic specificity in ways that the third student who worked with him, was Ray Wolfinger, did. So Wolfinger didn't publish his book for a number of years. He wanted Yale to publish it, and got reviewed and criticized and so forth. Finally, it came out, but he includes things like that is, Wolfinger was more interested in ethnicity, and would stress that let me update and then come back. The key mayor who was the hero in Who Governs is called Mayor Lee, who happened to be also Irish Catholic, but his style was more generally reform, inclusiveness, compromise. Let's bring everyone and give them a piece of the pie, and let's try to work things out in terms of what's good for the city as a whole. All right, that broad public good kind of style. Wolfinger, as a PhD student, walking around and going to meetings, doing maybe in some respects more field work than Dahl himself, has in his book an anecdote where in the middle of a tough meeting, committee of the city council, I believe it was, he the mayor, said to the main person he was starting to argue with, let's step out in the hall for a minute. And they went out in the hall, and the mayor grabbed the guy, pushed him against the wall, and said, "If you don't back me on this, you're gonna," it was almost a threat of something serious. And so Wolfinger was playing up things like that, which were going on around the edges, but that Dahl tended to play those down. And is now that per se, I would say that I'm bringing that in just to show you that even with 3 or 4 semi-loyal research assistants, you always get differences of opinion. And in this whole field of community power with 166 case studies, there were people saying things all over the lot, attacking each other on all kinds of fronts, and interpreting what was going on in different terms. Wolfinger's, well, I don't want to go too far except to say that Wolfinger built on this in the sense of spending much of his career on turnout, voter turnout. What led voters to come out, and what and where did that happen? Using all kinds of methods and so forth. But the case study of New Haven, which is also built into the book, is a stronger emphasis on ethnicity and ethnic specificity than Dahl tended to play up. Okay, so I've run through the names of the major ethnic groups in the history of New Haven, and I don't want to talk about this too long, but this is one of the most important books in the course, and as you can see, it's hard to put it down. It's written in a fairly easy to read, very unacademic manner. So these concepts I've given to you are the key concepts, but he does not really flag them. He just sort of introduces them in a casual way. So pay attention, maybe write them down, watch for them as you think and read as others have used them later on. Let me see. Okay, let me go on to Josephy a bit, and then let's have discussion. Josephy did a PhD here and was the teaching assistant and developed this course with me. We spent a long time writing the syllabus, and I've rewritten it chunks. But he was a wonderful, engaging, very talented guy as he was working on this stuff. He was born in Korea. I think he was 12 or so when his family moved to Orange County. His father was a dentist. He went to Berkeley for college and came here for a PhD program in political science. At Berkeley, he was there, I believe, at the very time when the state of California had a referendum on affirmative action. And the citizens of California said, we want to abolish affirmative action at the University of California. We do not want to have ethnic quotas. And what happened after that? Anybody know the simple story? In 1 year, I believe it was, the proportion of African Americans dropped by almost half, and the proportion of Asians roughly doubled. Josephy was an Asian. He felt terribly guilty about this, and has sort of carried on a sense of why am I here, and how did the guy not have a seat here who was here last year? So these are policies which change over time, and he then went on in his field work which was the MA was on Korean organizations and what were the activities of the Korean ethnic organizations in New York, Chicago, and LA. He basically found that they tended to be led by older Korean men who came here at middle age, did not want to have anything to do with Americans. They never learned English. They would go back to Korea and find a wife. They'd marry a Korean, and then return to Korea when they made enough money to be comfortable and retire. Okay, that pattern basically Joseph concluded led to disastrous Korean urban politics and engagement. They didn't know the local turf. And so the most visible scandal, if you will, was the LA riot. LA riots, I can't give you the date off my top of my head, but there are books on it and so forth. But it was the period when the LA police chief said it's too dangerous for our police to go out there. Too many people are fighting each other. So they didn't. And what did the Korean shop owners do? They brought out guns. They had big guns. They went and stood on top of their shops with machine guns, with big guns, and they got a very bad reputation with African Americans and Mexicans to some degree. It's mostly African Americans. And so after that, the leaders of the Korean associations left, went back to Korea, and Joseph followed up on this. And I also heard about this from a guy who's been doing a PhD with me for many years, and he was the director of the leading Chicago Korean Ethnic Association. And the same basic finding in New York, Chicago, and LA was the ethnic associations, Korean associations after that became young to middle age women who were born in the US, highly articulated English. They'd gone to top universities and colleges, who were interested in helping Koreans, not narrowly and self-centeredly, but in working with other Asian immigrant groups in Chinatown, Mexicans and others, and then generally helping African American and Mexicans, especially who were generally slightly lower in status, to build a sort of coalition of people working together to improve their city as a whole. And they had, and in later years, as I'm mentioning, especially the Chicago Korean Association, the Koreans no longer needed the kind of support which they would get of teaching them English or computers or helping with things which they got at the beginning. And so the Korean associations have hired not just Korean women, they've hired African Americans, Mexicans, Indians, and the people who they are serving tend to be African Americans, Mexicans, not Koreans, even though it's called the Korean Association. They're teaching them English, they're teaching them about computers, they're helping them get ahead in life, getting loans, starting businesses, all kinds of stuff. So and this grew out of a sense of how can we, and as I'm here, I mean, I've always lived in Bronzeville. I have several ministers, Black ministers, who know my Korean student who's been leading the Korean Association. Oh, so he's fantastic to work with. Yeah, we worked together for 20 years on citywide stuff. So they build coalitions and they lobby City Hall together because they're trying to build on the problems of overcoming that isolation, the ethnic isolation, and the anti-Korean reputation which they got from the LA riots, which were partially going on in a similar but much less acute manner in Chicago and New York. So that's Joseph Yee's MA and background. How did he make sense? What to do about this? Read the media, look on social media, look at most of the books, and the story is African Americans are poor, difficult, crime infested, irresponsible, and so forth. And it's always been that way and it'll always be that way. Joseph got to know more young African Americans in such places as he went around, and particularly he'd find out what they were interested in. Where did they go? What they spend their time with? Especially young African American men, maybe 15 to 25. And what did they voluntarily choose to do? Many of them had dropped out of school. They distrusted teachers and schools. Many did not know their fathers. Their mothers did not get along with them. Their mothers were spending time with their daughters. They'd go to the Baptist churches together. The sons were tended to be left out by the lower status. That was the general image, at least. Some of them went into gangs, but many of them went into 4 kinds of organizations, which Joseph then chose to study for his PhD. Martial arts, Amway, which is a direct sales organization like Mary Kay Cosmetics, where people know each other and they sell at a certain kind of discount price, rather than through big normal stores like Walgreens. Amway, evangelical churches, storefronts, little, but also others like the Mormons. And fourth, Soko Gakkai, which is a Japanese-funded Buddhist organization in the south side of Chicago. And what do these 4 organizations have in common? They're about 40% in New York, Chicago, and LA. They're roughly 40% African American. They're a minority, but they all have you've got to solve your own problems. And the most visible example is the martial arts master. And if a kid is there who may be 10 years, 11 years old, with his mother, they're both learning martial arts. And the master may say, "Did you do your homework last night? How many hours did you spend on it?" He said, "Oh, I was too busy doing something else." 20 push-ups right now. You should have done your homework. Points to the wall. 10 commandments that look like Moses's 10 commandments, but they may be, some places they may be the Christian 10 commandments, and other places they're variations of the Confucian and Buddhist traditional precepts, which are very close to the Christian 10 commandments. And basically the masters are teaching, imposing a moralistic perspective on the world, on yourself. Do well in school, work hard, get ahead on your own, not through government, not through the welfare state. And this is, I don't know, something like 5,000 years old in China. Martial arts are an old Chinese traditional activity. They're newish in the US, and they're very, very popular in African American neighborhoods. But the related point is they're not just African American, they're racially integrated. Not only the mother and the son, but you have white, Polish, Irish, Italian kids, young men usually, And my colleagues, Joseph Yee and Dan Silva, were both very active martial artists. So they published several papers on this stuff and chapters in Scenescapes and in Joseph's book. So the big point is, in all four of these organizations, you have the same kind of commitment to an ideology which is close to what we read about with Lipset's American exceptionalism, individualism, egalitarianism, laissez-faire, entrepreneurship. Do it on your own and get a black belt if you're in the martial arts. Get more sales if you're selling stuff for Amway. Be an evangelical preacher and bring in more members if you're part of the evangelical church, or if you're in part of Soko Gakkai. And with the classes, we don't try to do it without Joseph here, but when we were teaching it with him, we take the whole class to Soko Gakkai, and we would watch maybe 40% African Americans, and then people from the North Side, whites from the Loop, all chanting together in Japanese. And then afterward, they'd have a reception, and they'd give us food and say, come back again, try and visit, and so forth and so forth. And there's an African American guy in my building, lives down the hall, and he goes to Soko Gakkai. So I still get information from him about, hear about what they're doing. We also had some evangelical preachers, and the first time they came, they would come and it was rather dramatic. For instance, African American woman, maybe 35, would say, I was a prostitute, I drank, I used drugs, had children, gave them away, didn't want any part of that. And then I found God. And now I'm a new person. I want to tell you about it. Have you been through this? Okay, this was too much for our Hyde Park students. And several of the students said, you shouldn't be doing this at the University of Chicago. This is a violation of the separation between church and university, whatever. So Joseph, we talked about it. And so we sometimes would have a minister come and talk about his church, but having the confessions of that sort were very dramatic. But if you've never been to something like that, check it out. It's part of ethnicity, it's part of religion, and evangelical religion is arguably the most important distinctive aspect of the United States compared to Europe, even though we're just 90% Europeans. And the main lines of stuff that Lipset talks about. Okay, so the big point of that is the young Black men in all four of these organizations, many of them succeeded. They saw themselves as Horatio Algers. They were lifting themselves up by their own bootstraps and doing it right. As the former prostitute lady was telling her story, the more common story of the men was as well. Etc. I used to drink. I did all these bad things. Now I found God. I'm doing martial arts, and I'm in, and maybe not in all four of the organizations. They may have been in just one or two, but you got to an amazing degree, a highly personalized identity story that sounded rather close to Lipset's articulation of American values. Many people reading, talking about it as Joseph presented this, either couldn't believe it or didn't or whatever. The difference was it was presented with a more hierarchical background, like the master of martial arts didn't say, oh, you had trouble doing your homework last night? Oh, I'm sorry. Did you have a headache? Oh, I understand you didn't do your homework. No, 20 push-ups. So there's a toughness and a hierarchy, which all four of these organizations had, which Joseph got criticized for underplaying, if you will, by some of the folks who were reading him and discussing this stuff. But I think I've said enough to give you a flavor of two quite fascinating books that feed into, as you can see, ethnicity, current issues and ways of framing diversity. And Joseph's subtitle is, as you can see in the subtitle of the book, God and Karate on the South Side, cosmopolitan ethnicity. So that's looks like almost an impossible combination, but that's why he deliberately put that in, to try to show that these young African Americans were discovering or rediscovering American values at the same time they got there through these four organizations, which were to some degree all Asian. Martial arts, Amway, funded by the Japanese, a Buddhist organization, the evangelicals mixture, and martial arts, Amway, Soka Gakkai, and evangelical. Okay, so they were not, however, closed African American at all. They were open to racial integration for sure, but the hierarchy and the people near the top of the hierarchy tended to be Asians or Asian Americans who'd been here for a couple of generations, Chinese, Japanese, Korean, and yet at the same time, they shared with the young African Americans the ways in which what they were doing in each of these four domains could make a person with a black face also have a black belt, and perceive and discuss that in what they would talk about as meritocratically, that he was, he earned that black belt by doing hard work for a long time. And so the mother or the 12-year-old son might both be black belts, but only after lots of hard work together. Okay, questions, discussion of these issues.
Professor, one thought that I had in response to your point earlier about some individuals coming to speak in class and sharing their experiences and testimonies and how they've now gotten to religion as far as evangelicals are concerned. I find that really interesting, when you parse together their first transformation, and it may even better be described as a transfiguration, going from a broken state to a more beautiful state in which many feel with Jesus and religion and Christ. But then you look in communities and there's a sense of a need for retribution towards those who have failed, throw them away and bury the key for many in the justice system. And many of those systems still perpetuate the justice system in those communities, many urban, many going to church on Sundays, or at least have had experiences with religion in the past. So I'd just be interested in hearing how that dichotomy is kind of processed.
It's absolutely, you're putting your finger on central issues, to be sure. The church, or the multiple churches, I just contrasted along gender lines, the Baptists and Seventh and others, but religious institutions are the number one organizations in lower status African American neighborhoods all across the U.S. And what makes the U.S. I think when Mio put her finger on this, when she saw the contrast between France and the U.S. and China, what's the number one type of organization in the entire U.S. that Tocqueville talked about? Little and a few big churches. And then, but then the next step, which I didn't show you, but I'll just mention here briefly, if you contrast France and the US and you correlate the zip codes, the locations where these churches are in France and in the US, the churches are highly correlated with income, education, occupation. They're in beautiful cathedrals. They're close to where the old aristocrats and they're upper status neighborhoods distinctively. By contrast, in the US, it's the total opposite. The lower status and minority, especially African-American neighborhoods, the churches are highly disproportionately located in those areas where they have persons for whom the church is especially central. And of course, this comes from the South, where African Americans were not permitted to participate in a Lions Club or a business association in the old days, the 19th and early 20th century. Those were dominated by whites and excluded blacks altogether. So what that meant was the black churches became the Lions Club, the meeting place for young boys and girls, for battered women, for people who needed to get food or a loan to get through the next week, or social welfare, counseling. Churches did and do much more in African American neighborhoods than do Polish or Greek or other churches for other ethnic groups. So in that sense, it's absolutely central, but it's controversial. And I'm writing, as I've mentioned to you, I'm working on this project for 4 years now on Bronzeville Soul, and my co-authors include a storefront minister and the head of the Baptist Church, which was the first, the leading African American Baptist Church in Chicago on 31st Street. And we have lively discussions that go on. Most recently, well, I won't go on that. I want to mostly let you pose questions, but I won't try to elaborate. Does anyone else want to either elaborate on this or anything else I've discussed? How about just a brief global comparison here? As I made this sound, these two writings these three writings are all heavily American, but the most dramatic example now is India, with the Hindu party in power. And I think I already asked in class, what country in the world has the most Muslims in it? And the answer, I guess I asked, in anybody who remembers the answer? Number one is Indonesia. What's number two? Pakistan? No. Andrew, you got your hand up.
Yeah, isn't it India? About 200 million?
Absolutely. So India, with a Hindu party in the leadership, has the largest number of Muslims in the world after Indonesia. And you have the Hindu party basically is now closing down things like slaughterhouses, so the Muslims cannot eat beef because the Hindus say it's immoral, it's against our religion. We're not going to let anybody have beef in India. I mean, that it's not quite that far, but this is very difficult, nasty ethnic politics, and much more vigorous and difficult affirmative action based on the old residue of the caste system, where the castes are now civic groups, they're political parties, they're lobbying associations, et cetera. So you no longer have a caste system But instead, and some of the earlier leadership in the Indian national government was basically the lowest caste, the so-called untouchables, and they had in some states still. I'm not sure if they're but I've been in PhDs in anthropology hearings and presentations and workshops where the workings of affirmative action in India just make what we do here as very, very flimsy stuff. So in that way, the presence and the salience of, and that is okay. I won't elaborate enough beyond that quick statement, but my simple point is just having a little comparison, unless anyone with more of an Indian background wants to elaborate for us, to try to ask if any of these, or I'll ask if any of these kinds of things that I've talked about are things which you could bring in with a quick anecdote that might link with the more general themes as diversity is being discussed in the US today. Or maybe I'll mention a sort of descriptive point and anyone maybe want to elaborate. If you look at the number, at least when I was teaching at UCLA, I learned about the Asian Indians in LA County and then in California were the largest number of millionaires in LA County. This is where the film industry is based, with a Jewish elite. Nationally, I think the same is true, that there are more Asian Indian millionaires than there are Jewish millionaires. So the point about the diversity in the politics of ethnic politics is that some ethnic groups have succeeded by working together communally through political protest, and the African Americans, the civil rights, Martin Luther King, and the most dramatically visible successful example. Other ethnic groups have done the opposite. Asian Indians, Jews, Japanese are small enough in number that they've tended to rise within the political, the economic, the social system of the US without that use of the political system and working together collectively. Now, there are exceptions to that, and in more recent years, you tend to have some collectivism among some Asian Indians and others, but these are at least different ways of contrasting and even identifying both normative and positive differences in a place like Bronzeville. Should we do it together, or do we do it on our own one by one? And Jesse Jackson would give different speeches saying each of those to different sets of high school kids, and as a lobbyist in Washington. But anyone want to comment on any of this internationally? When Mio was pressed with a little bit on China, but yeah, Ram, you have your hand up. Good.
Yeah, I guess maybe just to bring back to the point of India, I think it connects with the Browning reading on the topic of coalition building, because the party in power right now, the BJP party, as you mentioned, Professor, is very conservative and places a very heavy focus on religion and like the maintenance of the caste system, essentially. Whereas other parties in power, like the AIA-DMK party in the South, use like the coalitions that the BJP party has kind of ignored, or the groups that the BJP party has kind of ignored, like the Untouchables and more socially progressive groups like LGBTQ plus communities and transgender communities, and tries to kind of like accumulate their support in like a fight against the BJP party. And that's kind of similar to like the biracial coalitions that Browning discussed in California.
Okay, great points. I mean, the big takeaway, and thank you very much for that, is that when we talk about context changes why and how A leads to B or B leads to C and so forth. And that the Indian context in this respect is one of the most dramatic in the world because of the caste system history. And the ways that these things then get worked out are illuminating in how much the US and then the different European countries illustrate different patterns of context, such as the churches in France versus with a Roman Catholic traditional elegant cathedrals, but minimal success in engaging the population. The French population has become highly secular, and young people are not in the churches. I don't want to cut you off. I have a sister who's anthropologist in Berkeley and for her career, and is a specialist on India. And so I've heard a lot of good stories and field work. But there are many things. Just one quick one-liner is the Max Weber book on the religion of India stresses the degree to which the Brahmins and upper status groups in India, instead of succeeding socially and economically, after a certain war where they lost out, they withdrew into the forest. So in a sense, they're like the wasps of New Haven who went to the suburbs. And so the suburbs in this case were the forests where these gurus who continue to be major globally important gurus today, especially in places like Berkeley. This is where I hear about all this stuff. They created, according to Max Weber, a sense of otherworldliness, that it is immoral to engage with the world. You are a more pure, clean, right, good person if you live in a forest and commune with God, pray, and devote your life to religion, and scorn everything to do with material well-being. And there were, of course, more in the 60s and 70s. Many of these gurus came from India and started various groups in the US, a few of which are still here, but many of them closed down after a while. But there was a lot of field work that students worked on those at the time, and they had elements of that similar kind of commitment, total commitment to a religious community. Again, Tocqueville talked about the churches. They're important in Bronzeville, but they're still very different. They're more of a means to the end of succeeding in ways that the Brahmin tradition was the opposite. At least a certain that part of Brahmins. Other comments, questions? What's a dull kind of point that we might bring to some of the discussions of diversity? I'd say one simple point that I haven't seen anybody elaborate. Maybe I haven't read enough. But if we think of, say, the diversity, what is diversity? Feminism, human rights, LGBTQ, Hispanic, and then within Hispanic, you get Mexican, Puerto Rican, more general Latin American, Brazilian, Argentine, Chilean, Colombian. That is we've got a lot of diversity and maybe issue specificity. So that the idea of issue specificity, which you've heard me talk about as a coherent part of the new political culture, links and grows out of the same point that Dahl made in defining separate issue areas. That if politics and decision-making and ideologies are specific to an issue area, they don't necessarily work in the same way as you get from one issue area to the next. So maybe the ways that you can succeed politically with women or some kinds of women will differ. And I gave you just one example of the National Organization for Women, the now Chicago director, who said, my goal in Chicago is to answer the phone and respond to each phone call. And when I asked, how about those things they talk about in Washington of advancing women's job opportunities, enhancing equality, equal rights, and so forth, the answer was, oh, that's what they do in Washington. That's not what we do here. So they, in a sense, you could say this is a local and issue specific kind of pattern, which should at least lead one to be cautious about overgeneralizing. Now, on the other hand, if we go so far as just to be journalists and historians, we're no longer social scientists. So it's a hard row to hoe to see, and many people choose different solutions. I'm not proposing any, but I'm simply pointing out, conversely, we don't want to act just like Floyd Hunter and say the world, everybody in the world is the same and the same solutions hold whether you're black, white, rich, poor, Muslim, or Hindu. And I'm in this sense, I'm following, say, William Julius Wilson, the distinguished Black sociologist, who in his last decade really discovered and wrote about a book on culture and said, we must recognize those specificities of African Americans and try to be responsive and build policies and solutions which will include some of the problems of the Black family or whatever, which are distinctively strong for African Americans in contrast to other ethnic groups. So in that sense, look for simple stories, ask where and why they shift according to the context, and then see if we can make a social science out of the cases, including a William Faulkner, a Nathaniel Hawthorne, and a master in a martial arts studio in different neighborhoods of Chicago. How to do so? We need all of your help. These are complicated issues, but they won't be gone in the next decade or two, I suggest. But we'll probably become more sophisticated in talking about them. I'm trying to bring in or link with the earlier discussions of these same issues. Not to say that there's one right way by any means, but concepts like those which Dahl introduced are very valuable in talking about ethnic politics as they are about politics and global, local politics in general. So take a look at Who Governs if you haven't memorized it already for other courses. We are over for today. We can continue with office hours with anybody who wants to stay on. And I'll just ask orally what we haven't sent out an email, but if there's anyone who is doing or considering a paper and would like to present some of it in the next couple of days that we have 3 sessions, I believe. This is now Monday, this Wednesday, and next Monday, and then the Wednesday of next week is a review session. I think I've got that right for the not the 9 weeks of the course, as I was confused in thinking we had 10 before. So if anyone wants to present or get feedback on a paper, maybe stop by, I mean, stay on with the office hours now and tell us about it. And we can see if there's a way you'd like to present something. Okay. Thank you, folks.
Thank you.